Welcome to SI Now. It's Monday, October 24th, and I'm Maggie Gray. Their nicknames differ as widely as their fighting styles. The man who calls himself the Crusher, Sergey Kovalev, fighting the man who calls himself the Son of God, Andre Ward. But this fight is anything but a matchup between good and evil. If you're looking for verbal sparring before the fight, look elsewhere. Both of these fighters are as likable as they come, but don't mistake their congeniality for dispassion. Each possesses one of boxing's most precious commodities, undefeated records, and they'd like to keep those zeros. For more on what we can expect on Saturday, November 19th at the T-Mobile Arena in Las Vegas, Nevada, I'm pleased to welcome in the host of HBO's World Championship Boxing coverage and the host of The Fight Game on HBO. Jim Lampley is here. Jim, so good to see you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Maggie.
We have two fighters who Ring Magazine are ranking pound for pound top 5. What are you expecting in this fight?
It's a tremendous style matchup. You yearn to see these matchups where one fighter very clearly and dynamically portrays one identity. Kovalev, the destroyer puncher, and another fighter portrays exactly the identity that can blunt that particular style or identity. And Andre Ward is a meticulous, somewhat defensively oriented boxer. This is the classic matchup between a go-forward destroyer like Kovalev and a thoughtful, intelligent stylist in Andre Ward. And as you say, they're both unbeaten, and they both have tremendous incentive to prove themselves in this fight.
Absolutely. Most people know that Ward was a bit handcuffed through many of his years that most people believe was his prime because of some contract disputes and some mismanagement, etc. What have you seen since he has gotten back onto a more regular fight schedule? He's had 3 bouts since June of 2015.
Not enough to know what he'll do against Kovalev, because his opposition in the 2 fights he's had this year was inadequate to show us what he can do against a fighter of Kovalev's talent and ability. And so Ward, because of the long stretch of inactivity, and because neither Sullivan Barrera nor the fella from Colombia, Alexander Brand, were capable of challenging him in any way, he's a little bit of a mystery going into the fight. But we know what we've seen in the past. And what we've seen in the past is a guy who is probably the best in the sport at looking at what you do, figuring out your style, and determining what he's going to be able to do in the ring against it, which will frustrate you and take away your best stuff. So he's by far the biggest challenge of Kovalev's career, regardless of whether Ward has proven anything in the past couple of years, which he hasn't.
Yeah, that's very interesting. What's at stake in this fight? I mean, can this be the fight that brings some of the casual eyeballs back to the sport now that Mayweather-Pacquiao's in the rearview mirror?
I doubt that, because neither is really a big blockbuster personality of the kind that breaks through to the general public. The fight that you're describing, that would probably be Canelo Alvarez versus Gennady Golovkin, when and if it takes place. This is more of a boxing purists fight. I think every legitimate boxing fan who knows anything about the sport will be extremely eager to see Kovalev Ward. I'm not sure that it crosses lines into the general public, even though Andre was the last American Olympic gold medal winner in boxing and has been plying his trade in front of the American public for quite some time.
Oakland native Andre Ward. You know, Jim, there was a time in this country when boxing was the most popular sport by a long shot. Nowadays, pro football, the NFL, is the most popular sport, but their viewership is down double digits this year. Is there anything that the NFL can learn from boxing and the mistakes that the sport made?
Well, I don't think so, because I doubt that distribution of the NFL product is ever going to change from its current platform of, saturated commercial television. Boxing's distribution pattern changed dramatically because of the decline in general interest, at the same time that we had an intensification of what you might call aficionado interest. So the combination of the internet and premium pay cable subscription type television is exactly the right distribution pattern for boxing. It means that you're maximizing a smaller audience. I think other cult sports might ultimately look at what's happened with boxing and see something there for themselves, but The NFL is the one sport which is still not a cult sport, but rather a generalist exercise. Virtually everybody in the country has some currency or some interest in what's going on in the NFL, and there really aren't any other sports like that. The closest thing to it would be the NBA.
Right. Do you still have an interest in the NFL? You've called hundreds of NFL games. I mean, before you got into the Boxing Hall of Fame, you had a long, distinguished career covering professional football and college.
I watched the Jets yesterday.
Okay. Hopefully that brought you some joy.
So I guess I can't tell you that I don't have any interest at all. But on the other hand, I live in San Diego, and that speaks for itself, doesn't it?
Oh, well, I guess the visiting team usually has a good time in San Diego. You know, you've broadcasted tennis, the Olympics, obviously boxing. What's your favorite non-boxing moment that you've had as a broadcaster?
Oh, well, you know, I went to 14 different Olympic Games. So, you know, there are countless moments. Choosing one moment would be impossible. But I always do say that as a feature reporter, as a guy who was there to look for an interview to put on the air after the actual telecast that evening in Lake Placid, I was in the arena on February 22, 1980. There were 7,750 official attendees to that event. You'd have to look to an actuarial chart to figure out how many of us are still left. But I always say to people that it's one of the greatest thrills of my life that I was actually in the building and saw the game.
What was the feeling like in that building? Can you describe?
Like nothing else that you've ever seen or could describe. It was a unique moment in political history. It was a unique moment in social history, and it was, you know, one of those things that absolutely couldn't happen. I still believe to this day that, and I've seen the two biggest upsets in boxing history because I was at Clay Liston February 25, 1964, and I called Tyson Douglas. But I do think the United States win over the Soviet Union 4-3 on February 22, 1980 is the largest upset in the history of American sports.
Gosh, Jim, we could talk to you all day about sports, not only boxing, but everything that you've seen and done. Thank you so much for being here, and enjoy the fight.
My privilege, Maggie. Thank you.
Thank you. Of course, the fight game returns Wednesday, November 16th. It leads up to the light heavyweight bout on November 19th. You can watch it on HBO pay-per-view.
It's everything you think it is, but then again, you need time to really process the entire situation. You know, you stand out on that platform afterwards, you're looking at the ballpark and the fans and the W flags everywhere. And truthfully, I do think about everybody. I think about the fans and their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents and everything that's been going on here for a while.
What a scene. That was Cubs manager Joe Maddon. The long wait is over, and after so many years racing to the bottom, for Cubs fans, a trip to the World Series has been met with equal parts relief as much as belief. For more, let's welcome in SI baseball writer Ben Ryder. I like the guy who just throws the beer just right over his shoulder. That's exciting. But, okay, Ben, let's think hard about this one because we know the Cubs' history, of course, but who really can claim the underdog role in this World Series? Because the Indians have had a lot of down years themselves.
Look, 108 years, Billy Goats. None of this stuff, in my opinion, has any bearing on the reality of this series, okay?
Okay.
I think if you look at the teams as they're presently constituted, without any history involved, the Cubs are clearly the favorite. The Indians are clearly the underdog, despite their magical run so far. Depleted pitching staff for the Indians. The Cubs have more power. They've got more depth. This is a Cubs series to win.
Okay, so let's map this out then for the Indians. If they're going to pull off the upset in your mind, then how are they going to do it?
Well, I think they have a few strengths here, and they might be able to take advantage of a few of the Cubs' weaknesses. One is clearly that bullpen. Andrew Miller, maybe he'll run out of gas someday. Maybe it'll be 10 years from now. Doesn't look like that's about to happen. The Indians' late-game bullpen gives them a bit of an advantage. So, too, does their base running. Their base stealing. This is the most efficient and best base running team in the league. And they're playing against a Cubs team that if they have any weaknesses, it is controlling the running game. It's not just John Lester.
Right.
A lot of their guys have trouble stopping base stealers. So if you get into a late game situation, which you might need to manufacture a run Dave Roberts style, I think that this might be where the Indians could eke out an advantage.
I hope Dave Roberts appreciates that, even though he's sitting at home now watching because his Dodgers have lost.
Well, his team couldn't do that. They didn't have those base stealers. That's one of the reasons.
He should have gotten out there.
Yeah.
And then if it's for the Cubs and if they're going to win this, is it just purely the pitching and the power? What else has to happen?
I think they just have to play their game. They really do. I mean, you look up and down that lineup. This could be the best lineup, even though it's an NL lineup, to ever play in a World Series. It's certainly possible if you look at it 1 through 9. You know, the Indians have all sorts of obstacles ahead of them. They're going to be without one of their 2 best home run hitters when the games are played at Wrigley Field because they don't have the DH. That means Mike Napoli, Carlos Santana, one of them is going to have to be on the bench. I'm not saying they can't do it, Maggie. I mean, I didn't think they were going to win either of the first 2 series. And they not only won them, but they killed the Red Sox and the Blue Jays. It's obviously a special team, but so are the Cubs.
Okay, David Ross, he's already broken one curse. That was in Boston. Yeah. Now he's playing in his final season. What has he added to this team?
A lot. He's added veteran leadership. He's added a guy who is John Lester's personal catcher, makes that guy feel comfortable out there. But I think he's really symbolic of just all of the thought that Theo Epstein and his men have put into the construction of this team. It's not just high-profile free agents. It's not just young phenoms. They have all those guys. It is the right mix of players, not just David Ross, but Lester himself, Ben Zobrist, a guy who's come in and provided that. This team has chemistry, too, on top of everything else.
Yeah, the makeups of these teams are really phenomenal. Yep. The managers as well. Looking at overall top to bottom in terms of pitching, which team would you give the advantage to?
Cubs, Maggie. And I wouldn't say that necessarily if the Indians were at full strength. You know, if we had Carlos Carrasco and, who knows, a healthy Danny Salazar out there, added that to the bullpen, maybe the Indians would have the advantage. But the fact is, if you're seriously considering throwing Ryan Merritt out there, I know what he did in the ALCS, that was pretty terrific. But if you're going to throw Ryan Merritt out there against Chicago in the World Series, that's a tough one. The Cubs have the advantage.
Yeah, the Cubs could feast on Ryan Merritt. Have you gotten him a gift from the wedding registry? I got him some dish towels. I hope everyone else got them, maybe the waffle iron.
I'm an impartial journalist. I can't be buying gifts.
Can't be buying him gifts. Okay. That's a nice story. You mentioned Salazar. How should Terry Francona use him? We know he threw a side session, so he could be available, maybe even to start. If Game 4, perhaps, how would you use him?
You know, throw him in the mix if you can pitch.
Starting or relief?
Doesn't really matter. It really doesn't as far as the way that Terry Francona has run this team. The only thing we know for sure is Corey Kluber starting Game 1, okay? After that, Game 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, TBD, okay? The good news is the Indians have one of the best guys at mixing and matching pitchers from the dugout in Francona. I'm sure he'll find a few innings for Danny Santana. The idea that he might come back after this long and give them, 7 solid innings against the Cubs, that's just not going to happen. I think we're going to see him used more selectively.
Okay, we'll see what Tito can do with that. And then also Kyle Schwarber, a face we have not seen since April.
Yeah.
Should he be DHing for the Cubs in this series?
I think they should keep him on the roster, or take him on the roster if possible. Obviously, he tore up his knee in April. Nobody thought he would be back by now. Here he is. This is a guy who hit 5 home runs in the playoffs last year. Against the Mets in that sweep in the NLCS, he was the only guy who hit. He's a special hitter. Yeah, I think you want to have him on the bench with the option to DH him. They have a lot of options to DH. Wilson Contreras could do that. Soler, Almora. But yeah, I mean, I want to take Kyle Schwarber to the World Series and use him if he can walk.
All right.
Which I think he can.
Ben Reiter, you're going to be covering the World Series, SI.com and Sports Illustrated magazine. Appreciate you stopping by. Thank you.
Thanks, Maggie.
Safe travels. While the Giants were winning in London, they are losing in the court of public opinion. The organization, its owner, and the league have been under fire for how they've handled kicker Josh Brown after his long history of domestic violence became public last week. Earlier, I spoke with former front office executive and player agent Andrew Brandt, who is a contributor to the MMQB.com. Andrew, Josh Brown has been placed on the commissioner's exempt list, which is essentially paid leave. What happens next?
Well, there's going to be an appeal, I would expect, from the union. Again, it's little known, Maggie, that the union fought this to begin with. There was a 1-game suspension, as we know. They appealed that, and that appeal was denied. Now he's been put on this commissioner exempt list from this policy 2 years ago that hasn't really been used in those 2 years. Commissioner exempt list, as you noted, with pay, so it's paid leave. We remember this from Adrian Peterson and Greg Hardy 2 years ago. Here we are back again. and there's an appeal process to be placed on that list. So I think the NFLPA will appeal that. We'll see what happens there. And I just think, Maggie, there's no way in God's green earth that Josh Brown played for the Giants again. I think at some point he's going to go from commissioner exemplis to terminated from the New York Giants.
Andrew, CBS has reported that owners and NFL executives are upset with how the league handled Josh Brown and hinting that the Giants got preferential treatment from the league. If that is true, what could the fallout be?
Well, that's an ominous perception, and it's one that people are raising, that John Mara is a close confidant and counselor, frankly, with Roger Goodell. They're longtime associates and friends. And of course, you have infighting throughout the league on who gets preferential treatment among the teams. I've been around that, Maggie. I saw it for 10 years. Everybody's worried about they get treated worse than the other guys. So here we go. Listen, it's not something you can argue too strenuously with, Maggie, because again, we thought we were in a 6-game policy. We heard about what happened. We heard that John Mara knew that there was abuse. We know there was a Pro Bowl incident, yet 1 game. So what's happening? What is different than 2 years ago when we have these new suspensions, these new investigations, these new hires in the NFL, very respected people like Lisa Friel and Cynthia Hogan, and we're still back to where we were. So that is an ominous perception, one that the NFL is going to have to deal with publicly at some point here soon.
Yeah, you mentioned dealing with it publicly. You have Roger Goodell, who's again looking very bad because of this incident. You have ratings down. Could this possibly be the thing that pushes Goodell out of his commissioner's role?
Well, let me say that's a leap, because we have not heard, we've heard what you just said about Mara, but we've not heard anyone come out and do anything but support Roger Goodell. So let's be clear on that. I do think this, however, there's got to be some fallout. And I'm not suggesting Goodell, but 2 years ago, this was the hot button issue. We thought we had it fixed. We thought these investigations would get cleaner, not messier, when you have a Washington sheriff saying somebody from the NFL didn't identify themselves with the NFL and said, I want some information on Josh Brown. Come on. We thought we were way beyond that. We've got to figure out what's going on. And again, this is not a good look for a league that supposedly had this resolved 2 years ago.
Andrew, one refrain we've heard often, it's not apples to apples, but it does underscore how unevenly the NFL doles out punishment. It's why would Tom Brady get a 4-game suspension when Josh Brown got a 1-game suspension? What is the answer to that question?
Yeah, and there are things like drugs and things like uniform violations and all those things. But people like me who are legal minds, know that some of this is collectively bargained and some of it's not, and some of it's integrity and some of it's domestic. Listen, I get that, but I understand the public is going to look at this and just compare this many games for deflating footballs, this many games for beating a wife. That is a natural reaction to the fan base, which the NFL is trying to please. It's only these people like me that say, well, collectively bargain, blah, blah, blah. That is the perception, and that's going to be a problem. So again, I think we're going to see a reaction to all this with Josh Brown. I don't see him lasting on the Giants long. I see a suspension being increased, whether it's indefinite like Ray Rice or not. Then we'll have union follow-up with appeals. It'll be a replay. And again, why are we here? Deja vu all over again.
Andrew Brand is a sports business analyst and a contributor to the mmqb.com. We appreciate your perspective, Andrew. Thank you.
Thanks, Maggie.
All right. On the field, it was a memorable Week 7 for a variety of reasons. Here is Ryan Aselta and Super Bowl champion Chris Canty with more.
All right, Chris, a bunch of surprises in Week 7, but let's start with probably the biggest surprise. That came in Philadelphia, where the Eagles knock off the previously unbeaten Vikings. Philly sacked Sam Bradford 6 times. They forced him into 3 turnovers. How were the Eagles able to harass Bradford so well in this game?
Well, the offensive line didn't play that well for the Minnesota Vikings, and Mike Zinner said that in the post-game press conference, said his guys were soft, and that's not what you want to hear from your head coach when he's describing your play. But yesterday was just a sloppy football game overall. 5 turnovers in the first quarter. The Minnesota Vikings can't play football like that. They can't afford to turn the ball over offensively. They rely on their defense and special teams to create short fields and opportunities to score. So they can't be putting their defense and their special teams in situations where they're giving the ball back to opposing offenses. That's not how they want to play. That's not their formula for success. That's why the Eagles were able to take advantage. They were able to win that football game. They scored on special teams. They were the one that generated the short fields for their offense, created opportunities for Carson Wentz to operate. So it looks like the Philadelphia Eagles took a page out of the Minnesota Vikings book and ended up coming out on top yesterday.
Yeah, Wentz wasn't great, did just enough. The Eagles now move on to take on the Cowboys in Week 8. Meantime, the Vikings will play at the Bears. All right, topic number 2, more quarterback drama in New York as Ryan Fitzpatrick replaces the injured Geno Smith and leads the Jets to a win over the Ravens. But, Chris, it was after the game where Fitzpatrick grabbed headlines calling out the team's owner and GM for losing faith in him. Take a listen.
The biggest thing in this game in order to last is to have belief in yourself, because when the owner stops believing in you and the GM stops believing in you and coaches stop believing in you, sometimes all you have is yourself.
Strong words from Fitzpatrick, Chris. Very surprising to hear from him. What do you think? Does he have a point calling out Woody Johnson and Mike McCagnon, or should a quarterback who was just benched, 11 interceptions on the year, pretty much keep his mouth shut?
Well, I mean, it's never a dull moment in that Jets locker room this season. I mean, they've just been giving us headline after headline after headline. And it's less than ideal to have your starting quarterback feel like the organization doesn't have his back. But I'm sure the organization feels like it's less than ideal that we have a quarterback that's thrown 11 interceptions through 7 games, and we just paid him a 1-year, $12 million contract. So I don't think the Jets organization feels like they're getting what they paid for in Ryan Fitzpatrick. But the contract details tell you how the organization felt about him coming into this season. Fitzpatrick wasn't going to be Mr. Right in terms of the long-term solution for the franchise at the quarterback position. He was just Mr. Right now. So I think it's important that that Jets franchise start to look to the future. They've got to be realistic about their expectations. They're 2-5, and this is not a team that's the Kansas City Chiefs of last year where they're going to go on this run and get a playoff position and compete in the playoffs. They're not built that way. They haven't been doing anything particularly well with any consistency. So I think it's important for the Jets franchise to evaluate the players on that roster now, and that means evaluating the quarterbacks that you have on that roster in Bryce Petty when he's healthy, when that shoulder comes back around, and Christian Hackenberg. This is not scholarship. This isn't college football. Those guys are getting paid. They're professionals. The Jets have 4 quarterbacks on their roster. It's time they see what they got in the young guys, because I think we're pretty much all set on Geno Smith and Ryan Fitzpatrick.
Pretty interesting. The rumors were that the move to bench Fitzpatrick came from above Todd Bowles. Well, I think this confirmed that with Fitzpatrick calling out the 2 guys above his head coach. They take on the Browns, Dolphins, and Rams in the next couple weeks. So who knows? Fitzpatrick could get a little something going here. I know you're not believing it.
I'm just saying it's not ideal when your starting quarterback is feeling that way and the organization, they're going back and forth. You don't want it to be a situation where it becomes divisive in the locker room.
All right, now speaking of quarterbacks who throw interceptions, Case Keenum threw 4 picks on Sunday in a 17-10 loss to the Giants. But after the game, Chris, Rams coach Jeff Fisher said he's sticking with Case at quarterback. What do you think? Is this the right move, or is it time to finally turn to top pick Jared Goff at QB?
Well, you're going to have these questions over the next couple of weeks because the Rams are going into a bye. They played the London game, so that's typically when teams will get their bye week when they have that scheduled ball game. But I will say this, it's an opportunity for them, but I don't think they will, because I think the organization understands how much they have to be, how much has gone into getting Jared Goff in terms of the collateral. They traded away a lot of draft picks. You look at this past draft, they swapped number 1 picks, gave 2 second-round picks and a third-round picks. At the top of next year's draft, they gave up a number 1 and a number 3. So that's a lot to invest in one player. They've got to make sure that they get this right in terms of putting Jared Goff in. When's the right time? Is the supporting cast playing well enough to allow him to be successful? They've got to make sure they make this move at the right time, because you don't want to put Jared Goff in there before he's ready, before the team around him is ready, because you don't want his success. You don't want him not to be in a position where he can't succeed, because that can set your franchise back some years.
And let's not forget, Case Keenum had a career week the week before. Completed 80% of his passes just a week ago. Clearly, they're going to take their time, as you're saying.
He completed a few too many to the Giants defensive backfield yesterday.
All right, let's finish up with Ajayi running wild in Miami. For a second straight week, Dolphins running back Jay Ajayi eclipsed the 200-yard mark, going for 214 in a win over the Bills. He became just the 4th back in the Super Bowl era to have back-to-back 200-yard performances. That company's win, O.J. Simpson, Earl Campbell, and Ricky Williams. Chris, Ajay, a second year back out of Boise State. Is this guy for real?
Well, listen, coming into this season, I thought he did a great job of running the ball in between the tackles. They want him to be that hammer for that offense, being able to establish a run game, keep the team on schedule in terms of downs and distances. But he didn't perform well early in the preseason, didn't perform early in the regular season, and so he took a backseat to Arian Foster, and then Arian Foster had the injuries, and so there became some question marks about whether he would be able to come back off the bench, would he have the confidence to be able to go out and perform, and he's responded the last 2 weeks, and their team has been able to have some success. So it's impressive to see him be able to perform and his team be able to win.
And he's taking the heat off of Ryan Tannehill. We're talking Dolphins, and we're not talking about Tannehill's job. That's a first 7 weeks into the season.
Well, I think that's a formula for success for the Dolphins. The less is more when it comes to Ryan Tannehill. So don't give him an opportunity for you to lose the game. And I think that Dolphins team will be in a situation where they can compete.
All right, now Ajay's performance was the icing on the cake to what was a great weekend down in Miami. The Dolphins celebrated Alumni Weekend where they honored former members of the organization that have dedicated hundreds of thousands of hours to helping the local community down there in South Florida. Now, the alumni base has helped raise close to $500 million by dedicating time and energy to service in the community. Former Miami legends, including Dan Marino, Bob Greasy, Nick Bonaconte, and Don Shula were part of the group that was honored at halftime of that Dolphins-Bills game on Sunday, and it really was a fitting tribute to some great work being done by the former Dolphins. Maggie?
Nice to see those guys helping out their community. That's going to do it for this Monday edition of SI Now. We'll be back tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern when I'll be joined by Turner Sports NBA analyst and former league executive Stu Jackson. Until then, you can keep up with all the latest news on SI.com. And don't forget to follow us on Twitter at SI Now Live. Have a great Monday. We'll see you tomorrow.
Earlier this month, the Colts released Antonio Cromartie, but now his wife says she knows why. Cromartie's wife posted on Instagram Wednesday saying that her husband lost his job